At the very end of the last lecture, we touched very briefly on the topic of behavior genetics. And behavior genetics here being the study of how genetic and environmental components lead to changes in our behavior. So basically saying that our behavior comes from both our genes and our environment, and those two factors interact to produce the behaviors that we see. So we're going to continue on with behavior genetics and actually delve into applying that field, some of the certain areas within that field. And to do so, we're going to talk about some very specific terms. The first of these terms is heredity. And heredity is just the passage of characteristics from parent to offspring by way of genes. It's a fancy way of saying inheritance, or specifically biological inheritance. So this is the idea that you inherit genetic material from your parents. So when we're talking about that inheritance, we're talking about heredity. Similar sounding, but with a different meaning, we can look at heritability. And heritability is looking at how much of the variation in a characteristic within a population can be attributed to genetic differences. Now this is a mouthful of a definition, but what it's basically telling us is it's going to be a measure, a specific statistic that we can use in fields related to genetics, of how well differences in people's genes account for differences in their traits. So if we use the example of height and differences in height, within a population you can have people who are very tall or very short or somewhere in the middle, but if we're looking at heritability, we're asking how much of that difference between people who are very tall and very short is actually caused by their genes, by their genetic material, rather than on other things like their environment. Now we can quantify heritability using something called a heritability coefficient. And this is just going to be a value somewhere between 0 and 1, where a heritability coefficient of 0 tells us that pretty much all the variability in a trait among people in a population is due to environmental factors, and a heritability coefficient of 1 is going to mean that the variability in that population is mostly due to genetic factors. In the literature, you might see this heritability coefficient called something like a heritability estimate or something like that. All are the same basic idea. They're just giving us that estimate of how much of the variation in a particular characteristic or trait within a population is being caused by genetic factors. And so to try and help us grasp what this kind of a concept is talking about, we can use an example. So a heritability coefficient of 0.5, it isn't actually telling us that 50% of a trait comes from genes and 50% comes from your environment. So if we're talking about height, and height has a heritability coefficient of 0.5, we're not saying that 50% of your height comes from your genes and 50% comes from your environment. How we actually interpret that is that within a particular population, so when you look at a group of people, and you look at the differences between the tallest person and the shortest person, 50% of the differences in their height is caused by their genetics. So we're not looking at specifically what is causing your absolute height. We're looking at that variability or that variation in a characteristic within a population and how much of that variation is caused by your genes. This is also a good place to tell you to keep in mind that our heritability coefficient can only tell us about that specific population that you're looking at. So the population you use to calculate this coefficient is the only population that coefficient applies to. It can't tell us about differences between populations, it just tells you about that particular population. And you can calculate heritability coefficients for a bunch of different groups, a bunch of different populations, but it's not really telling us much about why those groups are different. So just to make it clear the restrictions and some of the limitations of this particular measure. Now that we've actually talked about what a heritability coefficient is, let's actually look at a couple of examples. So we can look at this table here from the textbook where we have some heritability estimates or heritability coefficients for a couple of fairly common traits. Now, these heritability coefficients have been measured in a bunch of different populations, which is why you can actually see that a couple of them, including just IQ, I guess, is listed here as having a range of heritability estimates. And that's just because they've been looked at in multiple populations, and sometimes some of these different traits have pretty widely varying heritability coefficients. And that's again just because when we're measuring these within populations, those values can change. Now, at the very top of this chart here, we can look at things like height and weight, some physical traits. And we see that those have fairly high heritability coefficients, so 0.8 and 0.6 respectively. That's telling us that a good chunk of the variation that we see in individuals' height and weight within a population is actually controlled by their genetics. So a lot of the difference between people who are tall and short, and a lot of the difference between people who weigh a lot versus a little, those differences tend to be fairly genetically influenced. And that kind of makes sense. But as we move down the list, we get into things that are a little bit less physical and a little bit more psychological and behavioral. So we can talk about things like IQ or school achievement, activity levels, antisocial behavior, all those sorts of things. And we can see that a lot of these more behavioral and psychological traits end up having lower heritability estimates. So there's a smaller genetic factor that's influencing the differences that we're seeing within the population. There's still a genetic component to those traits because we are seeing that, say, a 0.4 heritability coefficient or a 0.3, those are still saying that there is a good chunk of the differences in the population that's being driven by genetics. It's just telling us that genetics aren't the only thing, the only factor driving those differences. So continuing on with our terms, I want to talk about a different term that we can use instead of just heritability coefficients. And this one is the concordance rate. And concordance rate is just a rate of co-occurrence of a characteristic among individuals. And again, that's a fancy way of saying, how likely are we to see two people who both have trait X? So how likely are we to see two people who both have blue eyes? And what we can tell from this information is if we have higher concordance rates between people who are more closely related, that tells us that there's probably a genetic contribution. So if you see two people with blue eyes, maybe there's a 1 in 100 chance that complete strangers both have blue eyes. But if your parents have blue eyes, you're a lot more likely than just 1 in 100 to have blue eyes. So that increased likelihood that comes with closer relatedness tells us that there's probably a genetic contribution. So a little bit of logical extensions there. But while we're on the topic of logic, it's really important to remember that we've already talked about behaviors and traits of interest as being influenced by both environment and genes. And family members, though they do give us that information of being more genetically related or more closely related genetically, they also come with an unfortunate confound, which is people generally tend to be raised in similar environments as their family. So you and your siblings share genetic material, but you also share a physical environment. So if you have this high concordance rate with things that your siblings have, is it because you're genetically related, or is it because you're sharing the same environment? And so as a researcher who looks into things like this, we would want to pick apart how much of that similarity, how much of that co-occurrence is coming from your genes and how much is coming from your environment. And this brings us to our first type of study, our first method of study that's going to allow us to try and pick apart genetic influences and environmental influences. and these are adoption studies. So with an adoption study, we're going to use some background information, some knowledge that we've already put together, and a little bit of logic, and we're going to try and pick apart genes and environment. So the basic method for an adoption study is that you start with a person who was adopted at a young age. So you're going to look at a database, perhaps, of people who were adopted, ideally while they were babies, but as young children would work as well. And you want to compare some characteristic of interest, maybe a behavior, maybe a personality type, something like that. And you want to compare the person that was adopted, and you want to compare their concordance rate with both their biological and adoptive parents. So we're going to walk through a couple of examples so that this makes a little bit of sense. But the idea here is that, say you have Steve, and Steve was adopted as a baby. And so Steve develops schizophrenia. And we want to see if schizophrenia has a biological or a genetic component, or if it's mostly environmentally influenced. So we can look at Steve and say, okay, so he has schizophrenia. Do the members of his adoptive family have schizophrenia? Do his adoptive parents have schizophrenia? If his adoptive parents have schizophrenia too, then we're saying, okay, well, we're seeing a high chance of schizophrenia in both the adoptee, the person who was adopted, and their adoptive family. But the adoptive family doesn't have any genes in common with the child that they adopted. So there's no shared genetic component, but there's a shared environmental component. So if the adoptee and the adoptive parents both have that trait, then we would say that we're pretty certain that there's an environmental component to that particular trait. So from our example, we would say that there's probably a strong environmental component to schizophrenia. Now, if we looked at Steve and his biological parents, so the people who gave birth to him, the people who he shares genetic material with, if both Steve and his biological parents have schizophrenia, then we know that, or we can infer or assume that there is going to be a strong genetic component to that trait, because Steve and the biological parents share genes, but because they were separated when he was adopted, they don't share an environment. So we can pick apart, is it the genes or is it the environment, by comparing that adoptive child with their biological and adoptive parents. And now I'm talking about one single person comparing to biological or adoptive parents, but in an actual adoption study, you would do this with hundreds, if not thousands, of children who had been adopted. So instead of just saying, does the biological parent have this trait as well, yes or no, we'd be looking at a likelihood or a concordance rate. How likely is it that both the child and the biological parent have the trait of interest? How likely is it that both the child and the adoptive parents have the trait of interest? And so if we use that example of people who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia, in reality, we see that there's a sort of 0.12 or a 12% concordance rate where biological family members of an adoptee who has schizophrenia also have schizophrenia. So we're saying that 12% of the biological parents surveyed in an adoption study looking at schizophrenia had schizophrenia if the child that they had adopted away also had schizophrenia. So that's telling us that there is a biological and therefore genetic component to schizophrenia. And we are more certain about this, we are more confident that there is a strong genetic component, because when we looked at the adopted children who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, only 13% of their adoptive family members, the people that they don't share any genes with, but that they share an environment with, only 13% of those people were also diagnosed with schizophrenia. So, if you are genetically related to someone who has schizophrenia, then you are more likely to also have schizophrenia. And that tells us, from the logic we established earlier on, that schizophrenia then has a genetic component to it. The second method that we want to talk through in order to compare the relative contributions of genes versus the environment to particular traits of interest is actually going to be twin studies. And then eventually we'll combine both adoption and twin studies into sort of the perfect way to study genes and environment in relation to traits. But before we get into that and before we start talking about twin studies, I want to take a minute and actually talk about twins. And specifically, there are actually two distinct types of twins that we want to talk about. Technically, there are a couple more rare types of twins that exist, but for as much as we care about it in this class, we're talking about the two major types of twins. And these are identical twins and fraternal twins. And we're going to use some terms interchangeably here. So we can talk about identical twins or monozygotic twins, or we'll talk about fraternal twins, which can also be called dizygotic twins. And I'll explain why they're called that in just a second. But let's start with the diagram on the screen here. And we're going to look at the top where it says identical twins. And identical twins happen in about 1 in 250 births. And to be an identical twin, you have to have one egg fertilized by one sperm, and then something weird happens, and when the zygote starts dividing, instead of those new cells that are forming, sticking together and forming one child, as normally happens, in this case, some of the cells break apart, and you end up with two identical zygotes, or fertilized eggs, and those will turn into two individuals who, because they came from the same fertilized egg, share all of their genetic material. There's a little bit of a caveat here where through mutations and as we're aging and things like that, there can be small differences between identical twins. But again, for the sake of this class, they are going to be effectively identical with 100% shared genetics. Now, I told you that this class of twin, this identical twin, can also be called monozygotic twins. And that's because it comes from originally a single zygote, a single fertilized egg. So that's why it's called monozygotic. And we'll use the terms identical and monozygotic pretty much interchangeably because both are used fairly often. So now that we've talked about the first type of twin, we can talk about the second kind, and these are fraternal twins. And fraternal twins happen just a little bit more often, about 1 in every 125 births. So actually quite a bit more often than identical twins. And with fraternal twins, instead of starting with a single fertilized egg that splits off into two distinct people, fraternal twins happen when, through some fluke, two eggs are released at one time and both end up fertilized. And so both are fertilized separately. And that tells us that fraternal twins are effectively just siblings who happen to be born at the exact same time. So they both come from fertilized eggs, different sperm fertilize both, so they have the same genetic sameness as normal siblings. So for what we care about, we're going to talk about them having about 50% shared genetic material, which is the same as what you would see between siblings who aren't twins. And again, we call these dizygotic twins because we start with two distinct zygotes. So we have two fertilized eggs that turn into two individuals who both have different genetic material, about 50% differences and 50% similarities in their genetic material. So now that we have our basis on different types of twins and how similar and different they are genetically, now we can start talking about twin studies. So we can use that knowledge that monozygotic and dizygotic, or identical and fraternal twins, share differing amounts of genetic material to start looking at differences between those two types of twins. So monozygotic twins share 100% of their genetic material. So if a trait is strongly influenced by our genes, then we would assume that monozygotic twins should be very, very close to each other in terms of that particular trait. So if we're talking about something physical like height, if one twin is very tall and height has a strong genetic component, then the second twin should also be very tall. And we can look at a correlation between those twins on their score for that particular trait. So if we look at a correlation between the height of twin 1 and the height of twin 2, we should get a pretty close to perfect positive correlation, or an almost 1 as our R value for a correlation between monozygotic twins when it's a strongly genetically influenced trait. On the other hand, our dizygotic twins share less genetic material than the monozygotic twins, so 50% instead of 100%. And so this would tell us that if something is strongly genetically influenced, dizygotic twins are sharing less genetic material, and so we should expect to see more variation in that trait. So if we're looking at height, one twin being tall doesn't necessarily tell us that the other is going to be the same height. They might be sort of tall, but there's going to be a little bit more wiggle room, a little bit more variability. And so the correlation is going to be a little bit weaker there. So because the dizygotic twins share less genetic material, we should see a weaker correlation. Again, we run into this issue where it's very difficult to tell environmental effects from genetic effects because both monozygotic and dizygotic twins would theoretically be raised in very similar environments with their families. So this is where we get to the kind of cool place where we can combine adoption studies and twin studies. So if we have twins who are adopted into separate families, this can make a great case study that lets us pick apart genetic influences and environmental influences with just another degree of information, giving us a little bit more information than just twin studies alone, especially when we have identical twins, because that 100% shared genetics gives us a really strong background on what the genetics of those two people look like. Now, to walk through an example that's going to help illustrate what the heck I'm talking about here, we're going to look at a specific collection of adoption plus twin studies. So this is sort of a meta-analysis that looks at a bunch of different studies that looked at the correlation in personality traits between twins, and specifically twins who had been either adopted or not adopted. So on this graph here, we can look at, on our y-axis, we have correlation for personality trait. So basically, the higher that number is, the closer that number is to 1, the more close we are to a perfect correlation between the two twins. Along the bottom, we're going to break them up into identical twins, or monozygotic twins, and fraternal twins, or dizygotic twins. And then within those sections, we can break them apart into the yellowish orange bar, ones that are reared together, basically meaning that they were raised in the same house, versus the green bar, where they're raised apart, when one of them is adopted away, or maybe both of them are adopted to separate families. So what we care about here is that if they are reared together we're going to assume a shared environment. If they are reared apart, then we're assuming no shared environment. So in the reared apart scenario, we're removing out any potential environmental influences. And then to try and pick apart our genetic influences, we can look at our identical twins who share 100% of their genetics, and our fraternal twins who only share 50% of their genetics. And so if we want to look into this graph and interpret what it's meaning, we look at our two identical twin bars, both the orangey yellow one and the green one, and our identical twins, whether they are reared together or reared apart, they're sitting at that 0.48 to 0.46 range. So it's a pretty decent correlation where the personality of one of the twins helps you sort of predict the personality of the other twin. It's a correlation of 0.47-ish in the middle, whether they're reared together or reared apart. And so that shows us that, okay, there is some kind of genetic component. And again, we are more strongly reassured of that genetic component because the identical twins, whether they're reared together or reared apart, still show a stronger correlation, the bars are higher, than fraternal twins, again, either reared together or reared apart. So having a stronger correlation with identical twins than we do with fraternal twins tells us that there's probably a very strong, at least partially strong, genetic component. And then if we want to pick apart our environmental factors, our identical twins don't give us a whole lot of data there. So whether they're reared together or reared apart, 0.48 and 0.46 are really close together. That's not giving us a massively significant difference between those two groups. But if we look at our fraternal twins, and the ones that are reared together have a 0.21 correlation, and the ones that are reared apart only have a 0.13 correlation. So there's a difference there, where those that are reared together have a larger correlation, where their personalities are more similar, and those that are reared apart have a lower correlation, so their personalities are less similar. So that gives us some evidence for an environmental component here. So we can take all of this information together and look at it and make a conclusion that personality has at least some genetic component and at least some environmental component. And we can run into cases where you can look up all sorts of different traits. So personality, you can look at physical type traits, things like height and weight. And you can start seeing cases where there's more environmental influence or there's more genetic influence. And sometimes we end up with really cool cases where there are interactions, where you'll see more or less of an environmental or genetic influence depending on what scenario it is. So for example, we can look at an example listed in the textbook where we looked at the heritability of criminal activity. And so in this study, they were looking at adoptive sons, so sons who had been adopted, and they were measuring their criminal records. Do they have one or do they not have one? And then they checked, do their biological fathers have criminal records? Do their adoptive fathers have criminal records? And to interpret those results, the son was less likely to have a criminal record if their biological father didn't have a criminal record. Even if the adoptive father did have a criminal record. So that gives us some inclination that there's probably a strong genetic component to criminal activity. But that's not the whole picture, because the highest level of criminality, so the highest correlation between the son having a criminal record, happened when both the biological father and the adoptive father had a criminal record. So we see an interaction here between genes and environment, where it's not just the genes. If it was just genes, then whether the biological father had a criminal record or not would be the only thing influencing whether the son had a criminal record or not. But here, the adoptive father had a role as well. So you see an interaction between genes and environment. And so we can kind of logically walk through some of these results from either twin or adoption studies, or twin and adoption studies if we're really lucky, and we can start picking apart how much of this particular trait seems to be influenced by genes versus how much seems to be influenced by the environment.